from the scruffy zone. Should be fixing that soon. Well, after session 5, things have definitely become suitably epic. I kind of had the vision of a monstrous form rising up from the Göteborg harbor and another monstrous form rising up from Vatten. And, that isn't quite where my now took things, which is fine. The focus really stayed in Göteborg. And so the now really has become. Now, some of you may be wondering, what is that? It is nothing more than a snapshot of everything I know. And yet, instead of being an enormous tome of scribbles and what ifs and explanations and complicated, essays or maps, it tends to be a form, a schematic form. In my case, it's kind of a bulleted outline, and in other people's case, it could be more of a mind map or something like that. But it's a very fine way of organizing play for this game. It's discussed in the book in some detail. Well, mine has formed. It usually takes a couple of sessions for it to, for the categorical or known things to sort of outnumber the question marks. And that flip occurred just before session 5 or moving into session 4 this time. And what it means is that I have a very comfortable notion of my agents of action, the non-player characters and the institutions. I have a notion of their deeper, beliefs or perspectives, where they've been, what they've done. And they're in a highly reactive state or proactive state in some cases. And the more proactive ones are the ones who kind of jump in. Those of you who've played Sorcerer will recognize a technique, the diagram technique, that aims at this. Those of you who have looked at the venture prep for Circle of Hands, or what I called originally stakes in Trollbabe, most of these are similar techniques. They're not identical, but they're all aiming at this ability of having proactive and reactive stuff to do. And as it turns out, this has really boomed in this particular case. I know things now that were question marks before. Havsmannen's parents are dead. Cosmonaut's suit was released or liberated from or escaped from the mysterious craft that prompted the mysterious events of 2011 that Ulf had supplied to me from, ripped from those headlines. Well, anyway, a lot of that has come together. Let me tell you a few things that were on my mind as I played and as I edited. First is that it's absolutely clear to me that I'm dropping the ball in 3 or 4 crucial places. One is Ulrika, whom I felt was well treated to start as an NPC. I felt strongly about playing her. I liked her, was interested in her viewpoint. And it kind of dwindled into sort of this annoying girlfriend who loses her keys thing. And suffice to say that in my now, as written at the moment, Ulrika is doing things and is no pain in the butt. She is active. So that when we see her again, she will be in motion, having done some stuff already. And it will neither be a plot hook nor an annoyance. So I'm kind of looking forward to that. Somewhat more directly during play, I noted that when Ulf rolled, he had a 12 or less to hit on his massive punch upon Runa. The rules include bonus dice for a number of things, surprise or just excitement about what's happening, and all of that is valid. So he needed a 13 or less, he rolled a 12. Now, all of a sudden, I found myself in the position of saying, oh, I should have stopped for a second to think about whether any of those were valid before the roll. Because it's a terrible sensation to be looking at the roll, which is 1 off, and saying to yourself, well, he should have been getting a +1 for that. So it's okay. It's 13 or less. You made your roll. See, that's real retroactive. It's real dodgy. It's a slippery slope. Even if you feel sincere that you would have given the bonus if you had been thinking about it before the roll, you can convince yourself of that any time. And it is a very dangerous place to permit yourself to walk in the role of adjudicator of bonuses. And so I felt real squicky about that and went with it, but then remembered later on that he gets his extra limb when he is grown like that, and that the extra limb by definition gives him a +1 on his attacks of this kind, and that's fantastic. So that means that the roll was valid without the bonus. And so even if I say sincerely to myself, oh, I would have given the bonus, and so technically now it's a 14 or less, okay, didn't need it. So I feel a little bit better. But note to self, mine's those before the dice hit the table, not after. So that's one thing. Another that some of you are probably wondering about is pushing your travel power in order to jump up an expanded scope. Is that valid? Well, the way the powers work is that if you look at the internal construction of a power and look at the point-based options inside them, then yes, those are accessible through pushing. Advantages are not accessible through pushing. You'll note that a few exceptions are made for attacks that are listed in the pushing section. It is conceivable that I should have put the ability to expand your scope in travel or awareness through pushing. In awareness, it would have to be an endurance-based power in the first place, but they often are. People often use that limitation. But it's not there in the rules, and I was thinking it was. And so what I did was against the rules, at least as they sit on that page, and yet looking at them as the author, I'm saying, you know what? A lot like the acquisition of certain advantages like piercing or area for blast that you can get through pushing, expanded scope should be there too. The endurance-based rules for it might be a little different than they stand by the points right now, but it's something to think about, something to say, well, do I really need a spot rule or a rules revision to make this possible? Anyway, what you see in play there is sort of my speculations along those lines, just to check it out. And actually, I think it worked very, very well with both the special effects of what Cosmonauts Flight actually is. It's kind of more of a surrealistic event than Flight in the first place. And that regional flight is something that he has thought about having before. That was actually the original build that we dialed back because he didn't play it that way. And so there's a certain gray area there in terms of stunting the power. And so suffice to say that what we've done is set it up for him to use points for regional flight later. And remember that permitting it through this kind of special effects-based logic this time does not guarantee that he, quote, can do it. Right? That's how special effects work. It's not a precedent at any point. So anyway, I spent a little more time talking about that than I planned. What else did I have in mind that I carefully listed in my head? A few things to point out: some nice use of presence, and some nice use of the timing, and nice use of pushing, and how all those things intersected to lay out what occurred that otherwise could have gone very differently. And I quite liked a lot of that. You should know that those zippy things that were zooming through the air and zapping them, those were actually 3 powers that I built. They weren't hazards. They were separate. They were, the Runa had one build for like being that trapped underwater dude with a big spread out brain. And he had another build, basically writing a different character sheet for now when he is this, hulking, slithering, swimming, monstrosity, maddened by the provocations upon the great dreamer, surging toward the shore. And this one had a power or powers that had the separate advantage, and so those were streaking through, and you saw their impacts, a couple of their impacts on the player characters. Clearly, in my now right now is, since those were released powers with their own endurance that zipped off and did stuff, and he released a ton of them. Clearly, they got to Björke, and perhaps the areas to the east of there. And so that's in my now, that as of this session, that's going to have, an impact. Now, I have also been giving some thought to stuff that hasn't come up in play. And as usual, when you read about the intelligence security services of any, nation or set of nations, you get all excited and learn so many things that you just got to start, superpowering them up and making them relevant. And in this case, I have learned a great deal about the history of the EU. I knew a certain amount, that its roots lay in some dubious zones decades and decades and decades ago. But it's pretty fascinating. The EU is a curious patchwork of openness and also some rather savage methods of economic control. In something that doesn't look like an alliance at all. And so learning about the history of Belgium and Luxembourg from well over a century ago is quite fascinating, and you can see the history of NATO is entangled in there as well. So when it comes to founding states for a number of important agreements, you will always find Belgium and Luxembourg in there. They're the only ones that are common to all of these different multinational agreements. And so it's real fascinating to say, okay, so that's a very small area with a very small, or rather a very identifiable policy power base. And how did, is that a democratic thing? How did that get established? What councils were involved? What machinations were involved, or agreements were brought forth in order for these things to occur and become these globally affecting devices today. So I have definitely delved into that, and I have a very strong idea of actually making up villains now. So so far we've been messing with weird backstory and spooky intelligence agencies, and now we're going to move into active individuals with superpowers who are doing bad things, and I'm feeling quite situated toward those. The reason they haven't shown up before, well, they don't have any, the heroes don't have any hunted situations that look like that. So now that we've sort of expanded out, the now has taken on much broader scope than just the character sheets. Those kinds of things are going to start appearing. Well, I'm sure I forgot a thing or two that I really wanted to mention here and there as I edited, but that'll do for now. And I think we're moving into, if not finishing up our entire game, we're certainly finishing up kind of a set of dynamic interacting elements that we were working with. And we'll have to see how the players feel about going on from there, or whether we feel like we've done our our cool 6-issue limited series and can call it. We'll find out. Thank you very much for sharing with us this entire experience.